Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Kafav, Shavua Tov, Modim Simcha to everyone. This week's learning is sponsored by Dina Becker for Refuah Shlema for Reuben Ephraim Ben Shoshana, Ron Becker. And today's daf is sponsored by Alana Kermeyer in honor of her dear father, Moshe Fox's fourth yahrzeit. Lilon Nishmat Moshe Yehuda Ben Harav Binyamin B'Chayet Tzipora. My father would have been equally surprised and proud that I'm learning the daf. And by Ira and Natanya Slomowitz, in memory of Ira's father, Rabbi Shlomo Slomowitz, Rav Harav Shlomo Ben Harav Dov Tzvi V'Masha on his yahrzeit. We're going to start with a new Mishnah at the bottom of Kaf Hey Amud Bet. You need a little bit of background for this Mishnah. We need to talk a little bit about what a bechor of an animal is. So it's the firstborn animal goes to the Kohen. In the time of the temple, that would mean the Kohen would have to slaughter it in the temple, had to be brought as a sacrifice. The only way, and then what would happen? So part of it would go on the altar and part of it, the Kohen would get to eat. However, if the animal becomes blemished, then it becomes the Kohen's property. He can eat it, he can sell it, he can do what he wants with it. So basically what happens is when there's no longer a temple and the Kohen can't bring it as a sacrifice anymore, the Kohen's a little bit stuck. He has to wait until it gets blemished. And only then is he allowed to slaughter it, because there's no way to bring it to the temple anymore, but it still doesn't mean that we're permitting this animal to eat because it has sanctity to it. So only once it gets blemished. So we have a case now. So imagine before Yantif starts. Okay, the other thing you have to know is the rabbis instituted that you can't just decide for yourself, is there a blemish or not? First of all, there's all these laws about blemishes. What's considered a blemish? There's two different types of blemishes. There's blemishes that, there's many types, but they fall into two categories. A blemish that will get better, and therefore that's not a blemish, that is a blemish that permits you to slaughter it, or a blemish that's permanent, right? So there's mum over, which means it'll pass, or a mum kavua, which means it's permanent. If it's permanent, then basically you're allowed to slaughter the animal. So before Yantif starts, right, the question is, do you have in mind that you're going to slaughter this animal? So it sort of depends on various things. Did it have a mum before, and you just hadn't shown it to a chacham yet? Are you allowed to show it to a chacham on Yantif or not? Is that something that's permitted on Yantif? So if, let's say, it already had a mum, and you're allowed to show it to an expert on Yantif, then you would imagine that you kind of had in mind, I plan to, I might slaughter this animal because if I get to a chacham and I ask him and he paskins for me that it's okay, then I would slaughter it. But let's say you think that you can't show it to a chacham. So then, even if it had a blemish before Yantif, you knew that you wouldn't be able to eat it on Yantif because you can't show it to a chacham. So basically, you know that you're not going to be eating this till after Yantif. So now what happens? Okay, those are two options we're going to see in terms of opinions of the rabbis. You have a case now. This Mishnah starts off, Bechor Shanafal Lebor. So you had this animal that presumably had a mum before, but you didn't know if it was a mum that was going to allow you to slaughter this animal or not. You hadn't yet shown it to a chacham, and now he falls into a pit. And what's the issue with falling into a pit? Well, if you don't get this animal out of the pit, he might die in the pit, right? He might die down there. So the question is, are you allowed to, right? It's a little bit of torture for the animal also to stay in this pit. So are you allowed to basically bring a chacham into the bor, have him check the animal, and if he says the mum that you have from before Yantif is really a problematic blemish, then you could take the animal out and slaughter it. That's the question. Are we allowed to do this? So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says, sure, send the expert down, have him check. And now we have two options. Either he's going to find a blemish or he's not going to find a blemish, right? Im yesh bo mum, meaning if he determines that the mum that you saw before Yantif was permanent, then ya'alev yishchot, then you can pull him out of there and slaughter it. V'im lav, but if not, lo yishchot, then you can't slaughter it. And presumably, we really should say, lo ya'alev yishchot, you can't take him out of here and slaughter him. Only says lo yishchot, we're going to get back to that soon. The Gemara is going to kind of raise a bit of a question with the language. Rabbi Yehuda says you can if, in fact, the mum was a real mum. Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol she'ein mumoni karmi ba'od yom ein zemin amuchan. If it wasn't determined to be a mum from before Yantif, that is not min amuchan. Now, ein min amuchan sounds like muktzah language, right? Which is very odd because if it's muktzah language, what do you see in this Mishnah? Rabbi Shimon holds muktzah and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't. It's the opposite of what we normally know the shitot to be. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda is always much more stringent with muktzah, and Rabbi Shimon has very limited muktzah cases. So the question is, what's the problem here according to Rabbi Shimon, and why does he argue with Rabbi Yehuda about this? So the Gemara is going to explain, and then we'll get to a machloket Rashi Tosfot about this. The Gemara says, "B'mai kamiflige." What's the root of their machloket? Inema, if you want to say, "Biro'in mumin kamiflige," that the whole debate is, are you allowed to show a mum to a specialist on Yantif or not? And then how would you say it? Rabbi Yehuda sover ro'im mumin b'yom tov. He holds that you can show it to a chacham. Now it makes sense. To Rabbi Yehuda, this isn't a case of muktzah. Why? Since you're allowed to show it to a chacham, again, remember the case as I described it. Yantif starts, you already knew there was a mum, but you didn't manage to go to a mumche yet, to show him, right? A mumche is an expert. So, right, it's usually a Talmid Chacham who knows the laws. So you didn't have a chance to show it. So you knew when Yantif started, though, maybe I'll go to show it on Yantif since you're permitted to do it. Therefore, when Yantif started, you had in mind that maybe I want to slaughter this animal tomorrow if I can get it checked out. So it's not muktzah because you already had in mind that you were going to use it. So that explains Rabbi Yehuda why he doesn't think it's a muktzah issue. The Rabbi Shimon or any kind of problematic issue. So Rabbi Shimon Saval, ein ro'in mumim b'yom tov. Rabbi Shimon says you can't show it to an expert on Yantif. So now, question number one is, why can't you show it to an expert on Yantif? So Rashi says there's two possible reasons. One is because you can't, showing it to a mumche is like going to a judge to paskin on something, right? Like a judge, you can't run a court on Yantif. And showing it to an expert is kind of like a court. So therefore, since you can't run court on Yantif, you can't show it to an expert. Another possibility is this isn't like something you would do on your own, right? Normally halacha, it's very rare that we have an halacha that you have to show something to a chacham to determine, right? Most things we're given the tools to be able to assess on our own. Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Is it this? Is it that, right? This is a case where it has to be shown to an expert. So that's why he thinks this is like either a judgment, or he says, since it has to be shown to an expert, in essence, he's fixing this animal. He's taking an animal that's not permitted to you and he's turning into permitted. And therefore, basically, he's fixing it for you. And then we go back to our classic tikkun kli, which is a problem, which is like, right, makeh b'patish, putting the final blow on building something or on creating something. So, and yes, Gita, I wanted to mention that where do you see a similar thing? In Sarat. When it comes to tzarat, leprosy, you have to show it to a kohen. Only he determines when you're tameh, when you're tahor, whether it's a person, a house, clothing, right? It's determined by the kohen. So it's a similar kind of thing. It's just different because there the Torah said it, here the rabbis said it. But yes, it's very similar to that. So now we have this machloket. Rabbi Shimon said, and by the way, Tosfot disagrees with Rashi and thinks that it's a muktzah issue. And even though Rabbi Shimon doesn't really hold muktzah, he does hold muktzah in extreme cases. And he'll call this an extreme case because he'll say, since you can't show it to a chacham, you for sure never had any thoughts that you were going to, right? You set this animal aside. You're clearly not going to use it on Yantif. And therefore, even he would hold its muktzah. So there's three options of what the issue is. Is it judgment? Is it fixing something? Or is it muktzah? Okay, so now, and you understand why Rabbi Shimon doesn't think it's muktzah, because Rabbi Yehuda, because he thinks that since you can show it to a chacham, then it is prepared. So that's why he doesn't think it's muktzah here. So now, what's the problem? The problem is that when we suggested, is this the machloket? It was introduced by the words inema. Inema means if you want to say, that means we're going to basically try to reject this. Okay, in the end, we're not going to reject it, but we're going to attempt to reject it. So if that's the case, that the machloket is, can you show it to a chacham or can't you show it to a chacham? Then liflagu biro'im mumim da'alma. Why is the case then in the Mishnah? If you wanted to say Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon disagree, can you show it to a chacham or not? The case shouldn't have been about a bechor shenafal lebol. It should be a bechor that had a mum from Erev Yom Tov. Are you allowed to show it to a specialist or are you not? That should have been the machloket, not this weird case about, oh, if your bechor happened to fall into a pit, can you or not? So the Gemara says, no. We're going to explain why, even though that really wasn't machloket, why did the Mishnah choose this case specifically? No, you needed to show this case because they want to teach you something additional. Ki Rabbi Yoshua kamash malan. You might have thought that because of the torture to the animal, there's always this issue that when there's pain to the animal, we try to permit certain things to allow us, right, to not have the animal sit in a pit all day long. So maybe because of that, we can do what we call ha'arama, some sort of little trickery, okay, with like a permitted trickery. Velaske means, and we could take him out. Like Rabbi Yoshua. What is Rabbi Yoshua? So Rashi tells us, if you look in Rashi, Velaske Rabbi Yoshua, Damar B'Perik Mishilim, that's further on in our Masechet, on Daf Lamed Zayin. Oto ve'epino. There's another halacha that you can't slaughter an animal and its son in the same day. So what if oto ve'epino fall into a pit and it's yantif and you want to take one of them out to slaughter it? So can you take both of them out? So comes Rabbi Yoshua and he says, here's the solution. If you want to get them both out, because of tsar balei chayim, we don't want to leave them in a pit. But since you can't slaughter both of them on today at the same time, right? You can only slaughter one. So what does he say? Well, you could slaughter either one. So pull the first one out and say, oh, I want to slaughter it. Take a look at the animal after you pull it out and say, you know what? I don't want this one. I prefer the other one. Then you could take the second one out and then you've taken them both out of the pit. And then that way you've solved your problem. Okay. So you're allowed to do that in order because of tsar balei chayim. So therefore, you might have thought that here we're going to permit it because of tsar balei chayim. Let's come up with some solution. Kamash malan, that there is no solution in this case. There's no good way to do ha'arama here because if it really doesn't have a mum from yesterday, that would have been, permitted you to slaughter it. There's nothing you could do about it. You can't take it out because there's otovet, but no, at least you could have potentially slaughtered each one of them. This one, you couldn't have slaughtered it. So therefore, they specifically used this case, even though they could have brought any case, they used this case to highlight two things. Number one, there's a machloket, rowing mumim on yantif or not. Can you show it to a chacham or not on yantif? Number two, even because of tsar balei chayim, there's no solution of ha'arama in this case. But we have another further question. If really that's the issue, and the whole issue now is tsar balei chayim, right? We would have thought maybe you could take it out, but you can't. So, ihachi lo yishchot, when Rabbi Yehuda says, if the chacham determines, remember, Rabbi Yehuda said the chacham can go down and check. If he determines that, in fact, there was no mum from yesterday, the mum from yesterday that you thought was a mum really isn't a mum that permits you, lo yishchot. Now, if the whole issue is tsar balei chayim, and we're trying to really, the main issue is not so much can you slaughter it, but the issue is, can we get the animal out of there to save the animal? And he says, no can do. Well, lo ya'alev yishchot mebayale. It should have said, don't pick it up, right? Don't take it out and slaughter it. It just said, don't slaughter it, which sounds like the slaughtering is the main thing and not taking it out of the pit. So that seems to reject what we just answered. So the Gemara says, lo tzricha da'avar ba'aske. The reason why they wanted to stress lo yishchot is that even if Rabbi Yehuda thinks you can't take the animal out, but let's say you did. Let's say someone pulled the animal out. Could you slaughter it? No. That's what Rabbi Yehuda is telling you. He's telling you that even if you took it out, if it didn't have a mum from yesterday that was a valid mum, a mum that was a real mum, then you can slaughter it. To which the Gemara asks, that's not any chiddush of the Mishnah. Of course you can't slaughter it. Why? You can only slaughter it if it has a blemish. So that's not a very unique halacha. That's an obvious halacha. In other words, if someone were to pull the animal out anyway, of course you can't slaughter it. It doesn't have a mum. Bechor is never permitted to slaughter if it doesn't have a mum. So the Gemara says, Lishchete, what are you talking about? Ha-tamhu. It's a tam, but tam means it doesn't have a blemish. It's complete. So of course you wouldn't be able to slaughter it. That can't possibly be. So they say, oh no, what they mean is lo yishchot. Again, this is all to explain, right? I just want to keep going back to the if the machloket is rowing mumim, not rowing mumim, why did they talk about the boar? Oh, they talked about the boar because they want to teach you, even though there's tsar balei chayim, you still can't take the animal out. If that's what they're trying to teach you, then, right, if it doesn't have a blemish, then you can't take the animal out. If that's what they're trying to teach you, it should have said, don't take the animal out and slaughter. Why does it say don't slaughter? Oh, don't slaughter is to teach you. Don't slaughter even if they already pulled the animal out. But if they pull the animal out, of course, you can't slaughter. It has a mum. It doesn't have a mum. What if you took it out and it got a mum, right? Either when it fell in the bore or sometime that day, on Yantif. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda only permits it to slaughter if it was already there from yesterday, because then it's not muktzah. Now he's telling you, You can't slaughter it, even if right now it has a blemish, or it got one on the way down into the bore, or somehow before it even went in the bore, maybe anytime on Yantif that a new mum developed, and that mum was really a problematic mum, in that case, still Rabbi Yehuda will say you can't slaughter it. Why? Because now we get into muktzah. It wasn't ready from yesterday, because when Yantif started, this didn't have a mum, right? It's true it had a mum, but that mum wasn't a problematic one. And this blemish, it didn't have. And that's what he's trying to tell you, that you can't do. Right? So then they say, Vaha muktzuhu. So they say, wait, if nafal bamum, of course it would be muktzah, right? So now they say, Ella de nafal bamum, it would have to be this case. If it's muktzah, then again, the whole idea is that Rabbi Yehuda wants to teach you this special law, just so, what kind of special law? Of course it would be muktzah. So they say, no, this is what he wanted to teach you. And this wasn't super obvious. Ella de nafal bamum over me'erev yom tov. This is, again, we're basically narrowing the Mishnah to a very unique case to explain the language lo yishchot, which is to tell you, if it fell into the pit and before Yantif it had a blemish, the Chacham goes down and determines the blemish it had yesterday was a passing blemish. But today it already turned into a permanent blemish. You might have thought, right now, that's the case lo yishchot. You might have thought, well, look, that same blemish that you thought about yesterday, and because of that, you thought maybe I'll slaughter this animal, turned into a permanent blemish today. It actually wasn't something that would have permitted you. And therefore, Kamash Malan comes Rabbi Yehuda to tell you, we're not going to allow you to slaughter it in this case. Because the mum that you saw yesterday, that with that you thought I'll slaughter the animal, wasn't in fact a real mum. It only became a mum today on Yantif. That's already, right, going into Rabbi Yehuda, who holds a very strict definition of muktzah. That's going to be muktzah, because the reason why it's permitted, right, why it's permitted to slaughter was not known to you yesterday, because it's not the same blemish. And on that basis, you're not allowed to slaughter it. And that's why, even though it should have said lo ya'alev yishchot, it used the language lo yishchot, right? It should have said lo ya'alev yishchot, because again, the main issue is, can you show it to a chacham? And right, according to him, you can show it to a chacham. And since he didn't find a blemish, you're not actually allowed to take it out, even though it's tsar balei chayim. That's the chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda. But it said lo yishchot, and no, not lo ya'alev yishchot, because it wanted to stress another halacha that Rabbi Yehuda is going to think it's super muktzah in that case, even though really you thought about it from before. Okay, that's a little bit complicated, but in the end, we basically say the machloket between them is that can you take it out on Yantif if it has a blemish or not? Can you can you show it to a chacham? Okay, so thanks for correcting. Maybe I said sacrificing when I meant slaughtering. Okay, this is all post-temple. Okay, we're talking not sacrificing. If I said that, I'm sorry. It's just, are you allowed to slaughter it? Okay, so slaughtering is the question. We're allowed to slaughter on Yantif, because you can eat animals, right? You can do ochal nefesh. Remember, you can't trap them, but you can slaughter them. So now the Gemara is going to bring another Beitzah, which is going to confuse things a little bit. Tana Rabbanit, bechor tam shenafal lebor. Notice the big difference between this case and the previous case. Previous case was just a bechor shenafal lebor, and we explained that it must be there was already a blemish on it from before, because otherwise there'd be nothing to talk about. And right, because otherwise for sure it would be muktzah, because going into Yantif, it didn't have a blemish. But now it's clear we're talking about, or I should say not exactly clear, but it's clear from what we see in front of us, the text, that we're talking about a bechor tam shenafal lebor. It didn't have a blemish at all when it fell into the pit on Yantif. Okay, why do I say it's not totally clear? Because Rashi says that there's another girsa of this Gemara. He first explains the Gemara the way we have it written. And then he says there's another girsa that it actually doesn't have the word tam, in which case it would be the same case as our Mishnah. And then we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi matches Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. And Rashi points out, and we've talked about this before, but it's always good to review these kind of things, which is Rabbi Yehuda, Stam in the Mishnah that we always refer to Rabbi Yehuda is Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, who lived a generation before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is always mentioned as Rebbe in the Mishnah, or Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Okay, so that's not the same Rabbi Yehuda. So if you get rid of the word tam, then Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's opinion will actually match Rabbi Yehuda. If you keep the word tam, then Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has a more lenient opinion than even Rabbi Yehuda had. Because Rabbi Yehuda will for sure say, if it didn't have a blemish before, of course it's muktzah and you can't slaughter it. Comes Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to say, Yered mumche v'yireh. I'm going to go with not Rashi, with the simple reading. Tam, it didn't have a blemish. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, Yered mumche v'yireh. He says, even though it didn't have a blemish before, now go check. Im yesh bo mum ya'aleh v'yishchot. Im lav lo yishchot. And the logic, Rashi explains, the logic according to this version is that even though it didn't have a blemish, so why wouldn't it be muktzah, right? You didn't think you were going to slaughter this animal on Yantif. He says, no. If you hold, you can show it to a mumche on Yantif. Then basically, imagine you have a bechor in your possession. Remember, you're supposed to sacrifice it, but you can't because there's no temple. So all you're doing all the time is waiting for this animal to get blemished. So before Yantif starts, you're already hoping that maybe on Yantif it'll get blemished and I can show it to a chacham and I can then slaughter it. So therefore, it's not muktzah, basically. We're going to say you already had in mind that maybe I'd slaughter it on Yantif. And therefore, he has a more lenient opinion that says you can slaughter it if it actually now is blemished. Bimlav, but if not, lo yishchot. So the wording matches Rabbi Yehuda exactly, but the case is different, unless you take out the word tam, and then it's talking about a mum from before, just like our Mishnah, and then it matches Rabbi Yehuda exactly. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe says in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Now again, who's Rabbi Shimon Stam? I just told you Rabbi Yehuda Stam is Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Eli. Rabbi Shimon Stam is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, famous. So Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe says to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, okay, they're both the generation after Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe is relating to Rabbi Shimon's opinion, and he says, Harei amru, but the rabbis say, presumably he's saying the rabbis all agree with Rabbi Shimon, and the rabbis already said, Ein roim mumim b'yom tov. You can't look at mums on Yom Tov, so what are you talking about? No can do. Ketzad, and now he's going to bring three cases. Okay, we're going to deal with these three cases and in the next amud. Nolad bo mum. So case number one, nolad bo mum me'erev Yom Tov. If the mum happened from before, ein mevaklin oto b'Yom Tov. You still can't check that on Yom Tov, right? We know that. That's Rabbi Shimon, right? He doesn't allow a chacham to check the mum in any case. Nolad bo mum. Case number two, nolad bo mum b'Yom Tov. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ein ze min hamuchan. Now notice the language Rabbi Shimon uses here is different, right? The first case he said, you can't check it on Yantif. The second case he says, if the mum happened on Yantif, ein ze min hamuchan. That's a different wording. It's more than not just you can't check it, but it wasn't ready at all. Because again, when Yantif started, you didn't think you were going to eat this animal, right? This is against Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. You thought maybe you were thinking maybe it'll get a blemish. But since he says you can't show it to a chacham, of course, if it didn't have a mum before, you wouldn't be able to show it to a chacham today. Vishavin. However, they both agree, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, she'im nolad hu mimo imo, shezeh min hamuchan. If it was born on Yantif with a mum, that would be okay. Why? Because when Yantif started, if you slaughter an animal and there's a fetus inside, you're allowed to eat the fetus without even slaughtering it. So that means that this animal was already, when Yantif started, you had in mind that maybe you'd eat it, the fetus, right? So therefore, that's a case of min hamuchan. So if it's born with its mum, right? If it wasn't born at all and you slaughtered the mother, you'd be able to eat the fetus. If it was slaughtered and then the animal came out, if the animal was born with a mum, you'd be allowed to eat it. If it wasn't with a mum, you'd have to wait till it got blemished. But if it's born with a mum, even Rabbi Shimon thinks that's min hamuchan, because when Yantif started, it was muchan agav imei, because of its mother. The mother was muchan, so it was muchan because it was in utero. So now comes the big issue for this next section. When Rabba bar Rav Huna heard this Mishnah, this Beitzah, what did he say? Darash Rabba bar Rav Huna. He said the following. They gave three cases here, Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe. I'm going to explain to you what the law is in all three cases, more so than what it said in the Beitzah. But I'm going to explain to you, this is the reading of the Beitzah. Nolad hu mimo imo. Okay, that last case. If it's born with its mum, mivaklin oto b'yom tov lechatchila. Okay, he says, no problem. Even then, a chacham, even though Rabbi Shimon holds a chacham is not allowed to check on Yantif, in that case, the chacham can even do it lechatchila. This isn't a b'diavad. If the chacham checked, you can eat it. We even allow a chacham to check. Okay, that's what he says. Soon we're going to reject this, but that's the first reading. So now, Amale Rav Nachman said to him, how could you possibly say this? Abba Tane, Abba's father, when Rav Nachman says this to Rabba bar Rav Huna, he either means my father or he means your father. Okay, someone's father, either Rav Huna, who is Rabba bar Rav Huna's father, or Rav Nachman's father, read the Beitzah in this way. Im avaru biklo mivukal. If he checked it anyway, then it would be okay. He said, if the fetus the baby is born, okay, the baby, whatever animal it is born, the bechor, with a blemish, and the chacham happened to check it, that's the version he had, it would be okay. Now, if you say if the chacham happened to check it, that means that really, Rabbi Shimon thinks the chacham can't check it in this case, but if he did, you'd be allowed to slaughter it, okay? So he says, how can you, Rabbi bar Rav Huna, possibly say that even lechatchila, Rabbi Shimon thinks you can go show it to a chacham? That's not the version of the Beitzah that my father or your father had. So Amar Abaye, we don't have a response from Rabbi bar Rav Huna, but Abaye comes to support the way the structure is going to work. Just I'll tell you in advance. Rabbi bar Rav Huna, Abaye is going to bring a support for Rabbi bar Rav Huna. The Rabbi Shimon thinks even lechatchila, in the case of the baby, you can check, okay? You can show it to a chacham on Yantif. Abaye is going to support that. And then Rabbi Yoshai is going to bring a Beitzah from Eretz Israel, that is going to make it clear that Abaye doesn't really have a good proof. And in the end, we're basically going to reject Rabbi bar Rav Huna and think that really only b'di'evet does this work. So Amar Abaye, kavatei de Rabbi bar Rav Huna mistap. I'm going to prove that he must be right. Makes more sense. Why? We'll go back to the Beitzah. The Beitzah midikatane tlata bave. Since the Beitzah set up, and here you can look at the chart on the sheet from today, the Beitzah set up three cases. It said, Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe said, here are three different cases. And each time he had a bit of a different wording for what we say. Remember, he said, so now we're going to quote it. Midikatane tlata bave. So here they are. Nolad bomu me'erev yom tov, ein mevaklino to b'yom tov. The first case was, if the moon was from yesterday, right, from before Yantif, you can't check it on Yantif. Now, we didn't say ein ze min hamuchan, like he said the next case. So what do we assume? When he said you can't check it on Yantif, that means you can't check it lechatchila hu delo, meaning ab initio. You can't go and say, let me go show it to a chacham. However, hadiavid shapir dame, but if you did it anyway, it would be okay. That's case number one. In other words, what he's going to assume is the three different cases have three different laws. In a lechatchila and a b'di'evet level, right? So case number one sounds like you can't do it, but if you did it, it would be okay, because it says you can't do it, but you can't do it seems to imply, but if you did, you'd be allowed to slaughter it. Case number two, when it says ein ze min hamuchan, right? No la b'mum b'yom tov. If the mum, the blemish, appeared on Yantif only, Rabbi Shimon omer, ein ze min hamuchan. Now, if you say ein ze min hamuchan, that seems to imply this wasn't ready at all. You never thought about this before Yantif. It's major muksa, which would then mean afilu b'di'evet namilo. That means even if a chacham ruled on it, you wouldn't be able to eat it. And then, so if we have one case which is not even b'di'evet, one case which is, well, don't do it ab initio, but if you did it, it's okay. So case number three, where he permits it, we're going to assume permits it even lechatchila, right? Even ab initio. So hadartane v'shavin she'im nolad hu mumo imo shezem min hamuchan would seem to imply, right? If it's born blemished, it would seem to imply afilu lechatchila nami. That's his proof. So Abaye proves Rabbi bar Rav Huna, who tried to say that third case would be, Rabbi Shimon would even allow it from the get-go to basically show it to a chacham, that would work. So now they said, no, we don't agree with you, because what's your whole proof, Abaye? Your proof is that this is listed as three separate cases with three different languages, right, for each one. So you think because of that. But we're going to tell you that this Beitzah was brought from Israel in a different manner. And that's going to show two of the cases are brought as one, which means there aren't these three separate cases with three different languages. And then therefore he's going to disprove Abaye's proof. V'haki ata Rav Oshaya. When Rav Oshaya came, ata v'ayte matnita biyade, he brought a Beitzah with him that said the following: Bein shenola b'mum me'erev Yom Tov, u'bein shenola lo b'Yom Tov, chachamim omrim ein ze min hamuchan. Remember, Rav Shimon ben Manasseh was giving the rabbi's opinion, who all agree with Rabbi Shimon. And it says here, whether it was born from Erev Yom Tov, or whether it was, whether the mum, not it was born, whether the mum was there from before Yom Tov, or the mum was created on Yom Tov, either way, the rabbis say, ein ze min hamuchan, which sounds like, lechatchila and b'diavad, this doesn't work, which would then imply that the case when it says v'shavin she'im nolad hu mumo imo shezeh min hamuchan, that case we would say is only b'diavad. That lechatchila, right? If one case is even b'diavad you can't, the next case is, well, you can't ideally show it to chacham, because remember, Rabbi Shimon holds you can't show it to a chacham at all. But if a chacham happened to check it, this baby that was born on Yom Tov it was born blemished, that would basically, we would say, that case we're going to permit if he checked it, but we're not going to permit it ab initio for him to check it on Yom Tov. And therefore he rejects that logic, right? That he rejects Rabba bar Rav Huna. What he really rejects is a biased proof. You proved it because you said there were three separate cases with three different languages, but the version of the Beitzah that we have lists two of them together as if it's one case, which are all, right, problematic, even on a b'diavad level. But what do we do with our Beitzah? Our Beitzah seems to say three cases, which Abai had, right, a good reason for saying that. Oh, very simply, we reject our Beitzah by saying, Hahi adabar ukamehi de mishabish v'tane. Our Beitzah, the first Beitzah we brought with the three, that was taught by adabar ukame, who you might not recognize his name because he's not so known. And what's he known for? He messed up Beitzahs. He used to bring them in a messed up manner. He wasn't careful about how he passed them down. And because of that, we can basically reject that Beitzah for Rav Oshaya's Beitzah and assume that his Beitzah is a better version, and therefore we reject. I'm Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, and now we're going to have further proof for what we brought on Rav Oshaya and against Abai and Rabba bar Rav Huna, and with Rav Nachman, who basically said it's only permitted b'diavad. Well, what does our Mishnah say? Tekatani Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol she'ein mumo nikar mi erev Yom Tov ein ze min hamuchan. My ein mumo nikar, when our Mishnah said that Rabbi Shimon said if you didn't see the moon before Yom Tov, then it's not min hamuchan. What does it mean? Ein mumo nikar, it wasn't noticeable. Ilema she'ein mumo nikar klal, if it meant there was no blemish at all, pshita, tzricha lemeimar. Of course, if there was no blemish, you wouldn't be able to use it. That's obvious. Ella, it must be delo itchazi lechacham me'erev Yom Tov imum kavua imum ovel. Tanimiat ein ze min hamuchan shma mina. Again, what do we want to prove? We wanted to prove that both cases, whether it had a mum before Yom Tov, whether it had a mum on Yom Tov, either which way, we're not going to allow it, even if, and that's number one, we won't let the chacham check, and even if you did, we're not going to permit you to slaughter it. So if we say that the case, and we're going to assume the wording ein ze min hamuchan means even b'diavad you can't. So what they want to prove is the case in our Mishnah must be it had a mum from Erev Yom Tov. He just hadn't checked it yet to see if it was. And what does Rabbi Shimon say? Ein ze min hamuchan. That was the case. The Rabba bar Rav Nachman, Rabba bar Rav Huna tried to prove that it's going to be allowed b'diavad if he already checked it. Here we prove it's not, because that's the case in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is where it had a mum. This is the way we understood our Mishnah to begin with. Had a mum, and then you checked it on Yom Tov, even though you're not supposed to. Even if you did, our Mishnah seems to imply ein ze min hamuchan, you wouldn't be able to slaughter it in any case. So we reject this possibility that maybe, and again, this was all to explain the two cases that they weren't. The case that Rabba bar Rav Huna was discussing was case number 3, when the baby, when the offspring is born with a mum, the bechor is born with a mum on Yom Tov. We're going to be lenient. The question is, how lenient are we? And it all depends on how stringent we are on the other two. The other two are different, each from each other, then we can go even more lenient here. But if the other two are the same, where even b'diavad it doesn't work, in this case, we're going to say, lechatchila it's no good, but b'diavad it will work. Okay, as opposed to saying, this case, even lechatchila, you can go show it to a chacham. So we basically reject that option, and we're left back with what we said earlier. Now we're moving on to a different sugya, but we're going to use this Beitzah that we just quoted as a potential proof or disproof for what we're going to say. Hillel asked Rava the following question. We're talking about Hillel the Amora, not Hillel the famous Hillel Zaken, who was a Tana. right? Hillel and Shammai, and then there's even his grandson. They're all Amoraim. This is a Tana. They're all Tanaim. This is an Amora from later. Hillel asked Rava the following question. Yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat or ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat? What does it mean, muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat? Generally, we define muktzah by when Shabbat or Yantif starts, what's the status of this object? Is it something permitted or not, right? Is it something that's usable to us right now or not usable? If it's not usable, it's muktzah. If it's usable, it's not. If it's usable, then it's not muktzah. So the Gemara is going to say, what is this muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat? I'll read it inside and then we'll explain. Hey chidam. If it was worthy to be used for something useful on ben hashmasho, when Shabbat came in, that's always the time for determining muktzah, then it's ra'oi, then of course it's not muktzah. If when Yantif came in or Shabbos came in, it was not valuable, useful for anything, then lo ichaze, then it's not. So what's the question? Then there wouldn't be any question here about muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat. What we're talking about is something that when Yantif came in, it was fine. So that would determine it's not muktzah. Then it became useless for whatever reason. Okay, we'll see some cases later. It became useless in the course of that day. And then it became useful again. So because obviously when it's useless, it's muktzah. The question is, do we say yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat, which means when Yantif came in, it was fine, but then it became muktzah, and then it became unmuktzah. So the question is, since it became muktzah in the middle of Shabbat, do we say yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat, which means, it's a little strange, the language. It means once we said it's muktzah in the middle of Shabbat or Yantif, that determines its status for the rest of the day. And even if it becomes valuable or useful again, we're still going to say it's no good. Okay, it's muktzah. Or do we say ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat? Even though it was for a few hours there, muktzah, it doesn't matter. Now that it's useful again, it goes back to its original status and it's not muktzah. So the question is, what do we say? So we're going to basically have two versions of the answer that are opposite of each other. Okay, one says yes, one says no. And each time we're going to bring the Beitzah to either support or disprove, depending on which answer we use. So what's the case? What's the situation? What's the law? Amar le. So Rava answered him, yesh muktzah. There is muktzah. So now, meaning, once it became muktzah, it stays muktzah for the rest of Shabbat or Yantif. So they say, wait a minute. Eitive, look at our Beitzah. Vishavin she'im nolad umumo imo shezem min hamuchan. Amai. Name a high bechor. Now let's go through the stages. This bechor that was born on Shabbat, on Yantif. Me'ikara havachaze agav ime. First, it was not muktzah when Yantif started because it was in its mother's womb. That doesn't make it muktzah because you might slaughter the mother. It yalidle, when it's born, itchele. Why was it itche? It was rejected. It becomes muktzah because it's a bechor, and a bechor can't be slaughtered unless it has a mum. So it's born as a bechor, which makes it immediately rejected, right? As soon as you send it to a chacham to check it, then it becomes permitted. And then we say you can slaughter it. Remember, even Rabbi Shimon said you could slaughter it. It's not muktzah. So you see, yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat, because once it became muktzah and then it became useful again, we didn't say the muktzah status remains all of Yantif. So Amar Abai b'Temur of Safra kigon di yatve dayine hatam. No. It wasn't like it went through three stages, right? Not muktzah, muktzah, not muktzah. You wanted to say that it became muktzah when it was born. But I want to tell you that the case must be that there were dayanim sitting there, watched the birth. As it was coming out, they saw the blemish. They said, look at that blemished animal. That means that it was never muktzah, because as it was born, before it even came out, they already were determining that there's a mum. And therefore, this case doesn't prove anything. So we tried to use it to reject the answer. In the end, we can't reject the answer. But second version is, the second version is he said the opposite. And if he said ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat, that once it becomes usable again, it's not going to be muktzah anymore. Well, then we're going to bring lema mesayale. Let's bring this Beitzah as proof for this answer. Because look, v'shavin she'em im nolad hu mumo imo shezem min hamuchan v'ha bechor me'ikar havachaze agavime. We're going to say the same thing. This case was fine when Yantif came in. It then became rejected when it was born. When you showed it to the Chacham, then it became permitted, and then you can slaughter it. So Amar Abaye, V'Tamer of Safra, again, they say, oh no, you can't prove anything from here against the mirror image of that sugya. You can't prove anything from here because because there were judges sitting right there, you could say, in which case it was never muktzah at all. So again, it's not a case of muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos or not, and therefore you can't learn anything from here. So basically, two versions of an answer. Each time we try to bring our Beitzah to either support or disprove. The Beitzah in the end has nothing to do with this, we say, or potentially doesn't have anything to do with this, so it can't really help. Now we're still stuck because we have one version that says yes, one version that says no. So the question is, what's the story? So we're going to bring two more sources. We'll see one today and one tomorrow. But both of them are actually going to be rejected and say they're not really cases of yesh muktzah. They're not cases of muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos, so you can't really learn anything from them. Tashma, haya ochel ba'anavim, v'hotir v'he'elan l'gag la'asom mehem tzimukim. If you were eating grapes and you had some left over and you put them on your roof, not on Yantif, during the week, you put them on your roof to dry out. And there's an assumption here, one of the high levels of muktzah, and it's actually called the muktzah, is the place on the roof where they would put the fruits to dry out. That's called the muktzah because you set it aside and you don't plan to use them until they're fully dry. They become, grapes are really good when they're fresh and they're good when they're dried, but when they're in between, the way that, I mean, I've never tried this, but they're seemingly inedible, okay? So therefore, and you set them aside, you want to dry them out. So you're not planning to use them until they're fully dried. I don't know if they're actually inedible, but you clearly don't plan to eat them until they're fully dried, right? Because you put them up there. Or or you took figs and you put them up, right? You were eating them, and then whatever you didn't finish, you put them up to turn them into dried figs. You can't eat them on Shabbos or Yantif unless you set them aside before you did some sort of hazmanah. You said, I plan to eat these tomorrow. So the Gemara says, what on earth are you talking about? Okay. Oh, and by the way, before we finish, there's more to that, right? Okay. And this you find in peaches and quinces and any other fruits that you put up to dry. Same thing. So the Gemara says, Hechidami, what is the case here? If they were dried out before Shabbat started or Yantif started, lama le hazmanah. You don't need to do hazmanah. You don't need to say, I plan to eat these. They're dry. They're ready. What's the difference? What you said. And if they weren't ready when Shabbos or Yantif started, what does it help you to say, I plan to eat these? Nobody eats them, right? This is where it seems like they're inedible. Nobody eats them before they're fully dried. Hazmanah shouldn't help you. So either hazmanah is useless or it shouldn't help you. So b'chitema. Let's say I was too lazy or I didn't have time. I was busy Friday. This happens all the time, right? You're too busy. You remember when Shabbat comes in, I forgot to do this, right? Or actually in this case, you knew that you were not going to have enough time to do it. So you said, listen, I'm being mazmin them in case they're ready. Okay. Well, if that's the case, that also is irrelevant. If they fully dried out, even if you don't know that they fully dried out, they're permitted. So again, you don't need to do hazmanah. So therefore, it must be, they're going to basically say it must be a case of muktzah l'chatzi Shabbat. What would the case be? It must be, they're trying to find a case where the hazmanah is meaningful, that it does something. What happened? They were ready when Yantif started, or Shabbat. Then let's say it rained and they got all full of liquid and stuff, and then they dried out again. So for a certain time period, they were ruined in the middle of Shabbos or Yantif. They weren't ripe. They weren't good anymore. They weren't dry. But then they became dried again. And then your hazmanah would help. So now, Iyamar ein muktzah, if you say ein muktzah, well then lama le hazmanah. Then if you wouldn't even need hazmanah if you say ein muktzah, because again, they're obviously not going to be good when they're not edible. But once they dry out again later in the afternoon, so then we should say, right, then you don't need hazmanah. If you say ein muktzah, means it goes back to its original status. Since you started Yantif, it was prepared for you. Then this is prepared for you. You can eat it. Hazmanah doesn't help you. And therefore, it must be elamai yesh muktzah. It must be, there is muktzah. But wait a minute. If you're going to say yesh muktzah, and really these are muktzah for all of Shabbat once they get ruined, even though now they're edible, ki azmin lehu ma'have. But again, how can hazmanah that you did on Erev Yantif help you for that? That doesn't make any sense either. So we're back to saying something doesn't jive here. And we thought we could bring this as an answer to our question, but really we can't. Lo tzricha, it must be that wasn't the case. Okay. Again, you might have thought that's a strange case, and really it is. And that's not the case of the Beitzah. The case must be the ichazu v'lo ichazu. It must be that they're mostly dried, but not fully dried. And there's some people who are willing to eat their raisins at that stage. And there's some people who aren't willing to eat them like that. So what does Hazmana help you? In other words, again, we're trying to figure out why, if I say I'm planning to eat these on Yantif, it's effective. And why do we need it? It must be Azmin Galedate. Lo Azmin lo Galedate. And some people eat them and some people don't. If I want to eat these on Yantif, I have to do Hazmana before and say, I'm of the people who eat these at this stage, and therefore I plan to eat them. If not, we assume I'm part of the majority, probably, that don't eat them until they're fully dried. So unless I do Hazmana, I can't eat them. In which case, this has absolutely nothing to do with Yesh Muktzah L'Chatzi Shabbat or Ein Muktzah L'Chatzi Shabbat, because this isn't the case of Muktzah L'Chatzi Shabbat. So we're back to square one, and we don't have an answer. And as I told you, we're going to see a possible answer tomorrow, but it's also going to be rejected. And with that, we'll be left with a question without an answer. So have a great day, everyone. Moadim l'simcha.